Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. You can utterly rest assured I won't be starting this podcast with the noise that infested pretty much every movie trailer for nearly a decade. Not me.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try really hard not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, a real appreciation that somehow, through all the challenges presented to them, films get made, and I, for one, am very, very grateful that they do. I'm recording this podcast just as our revamped Film Stories magazine has gone on sale as well. I wouldn't usually plug that right at the start, but just indulge me just this once. It is now the UK's biggest film magazine. You can find out why at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now, enough preamble. Getting on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. As always, I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. I'm going to come to the story, the other side of this.
There's one thing you should know about me. I specialize in a very specific type of security. Subconscious security.
You talking about dreams?
Mr. Cobb has a job offer he would like to discuss with you.
Like a work placement?
Not exactly.
We create the world of the dream. We bring the subject into that dream, and they fill it with their secrets.
Then you break in and steal it.
Well, it's not strictly speaking legal. It's called Inception. I'm ready.
And that, of course, is a clip from 2010's Inception, written and directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Ken Watanabe, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Marion Cotillard, Elliot Page, here credited as Ellen Page, Tom Hardy, Cillian Murphy, Tom Berenger, and Michael Caine. And so, the story of Inception, well, in a strange way, it goes back to Christopher Nolan's childhood. Now, at the point in 2010 when he made the film, he was very much an established talent. He'd done two of his three Batman films. He'd done The Prestige, he'd done Memento, he'd done Insomnia as well. But he talked around the release of Inception that he'd been interested in dreams since he was a kid, and he's been wanting to do a film about them for a long, long time. Now, this went back to his childhood, just watching a Freddy Krueger spin-off TV series of all things when he was growing up. And he talked to The Telegraph. He said, I was thinking along the lines of a horror movie at first, but eventually it became this project. He said, I was looking for a device whereby the dreams would become important to the story, and the thought that someone could invade your dream space and steal an idea is immensely compelling to me. He also argued that the concept that dreams feel real while we're in them underlies the whole film. It wasn't, though, until the early 2000s where he really started to get an idea of how he could approach a story in and around the world of dreams. He'd wrapped up the film Insomnia for Warner Brothers, which came out in 2002, and that's when he first put down on paper an 80-page treatment for what would become Inception nearly a decade later. Now, he explained this in the Nolan Variations book by Tom Shon, which is an excellent book, which I draw on a reasonable amount for this particular story. And he talked at that stage, when he was putting the earliest treatments together, about Inception was this gothic story about dream theft that had germinated when he was in his dorm while in sixth form at Haileybury, where he was studying. And he said he'd gone back to the idea several times over the years, and by now it had grown from that early German idea into a heist movie set against a backdrop of corporate espionage, whilst warring Japanese chemical companies were in the story. And also there was a reference really to a kind of feeling of the James Bond films that Nolan loved as well. In particular, You Only Live Twice was a named touch point here. And so he got talking to Warner Brothers, where by this stage he had a very, very healthy relationship. And why wouldn't he? He was delivering hit after hit for the studio. Every film he'd done for Warner Brothers had hit big. In the case of The Dark Knight, it had grossed over $1 billion at the global box office as well. And Warner Brothers, at this stage, a studio famous for its relationships with filmmakers, was of course going to be interested in the next Christopher Nolan movie. So he talked about this kind of heist film just as Warner's was counting all the money from Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11 remake at the start of the 2000s. So yeah, just the kind of thing it was looking for. But the problem Nolan hit at that stage was he couldn't reconcile the emotional hook of the story. He got those 80 pages down, but what he couldn't do was reach a kind of end point, a point where he was satisfied with where the story was going, and he couldn't develop it at that stage into a fully formed screenplay. And so he went on to do other projects. He embarked on things like Batman Begins. He embarked on The Prestige. He embarked on The Dark Knight. And the increasing success of these films gave him the clout to get difficult projects off the ground. And it wasn't really until after he'd finished The Dark Knight that he got to the point where he worked out how to turn the idea of Inception from an 80-page treatment into an actual script, that he'd continued noodling with it on and off over the years. And over that time as well, the film had gone from this small, low-budget production Nolan had originally envisaged it as, to a much larger scale film. Now, in the intervening period as well, Nolan had toyed with the idea of making a biopic of the legendary Hollywood figure Howard Hughes, but he was beaten to that idea by others, and so he would take some of the leftover ideas from that and he would weave them into the Inception script as well, and they would resolve one or two of the emotional problems he had in completing the story. He also had really convinced Warner Brothers and Legendary Pictures, that would co-finance, as to how to manage the complexity of the story and the levels of dreams that we see in the movie. If you've not seen the film, it's very, very hard to explain this in a podcast, but there are dreams at certain levels, and as Nolan explained to Deadline, he went to Warner Brothers, he said one of the dream levels is in the rain, one is in the night interior, one is outdoors in the snow, and that means even in a close-up you'd be able to tell which level you were in as you cut across. And so Warner Brothers and Legendary, Nolan said, were very aware of the risky nature of the project, but they just got very excited about seeing the film. Incidentally, jumping ahead, I mean, the actors also had to work with which level of dream are we in here? And it was little cues, as Tom Hardy said, like the costumes they were wearing at a certain point, what shoes were they in, and things. And if they ever needed to kind of recenter themselves, they would just look at what they were wearing and have a better appreciation as to what part of the story and what part of the dreams they were in. Could get really confusing, all of this. Nolan fleshing out the story, he didn't dive too heavily into research. That wasn't really his way, particularly on this film, and his process was to rely and lean more on his own experience. I mean, he would argue to Collider that if the research contradicts what you want to do, well, that you tend to go ahead and just do it anyway. And so Nolan said at a certain point, I realised if you're trying to reach an audience, being as subjective as possible and really trying to write from something genuine is the way to go. And he says, really, it's mostly from my own process, my own experience. That's where the film was coming together. So it was after the release of The Dark Knight, a very intense period for lots of reasons, not least the tragic loss of Heath Ledger in post-production on that film, that he and Emma Thomas, his longtime producer and partner, they went away on holiday, that they'd spent the best part of a decade making films pretty much back to back. They went off to Florida for a month, and it was there really that Nolan revisited his Inception idea in earnest, and realised he knew how to do it. He also realised he could write this one entirely by himself, that his film since Memento he'd had a collaborator on. This was going to be his first sole screenplay credit for several films, but he could get the script to a point where this was now tangibly going to be his next project. And so it got to the point where he could take this out to actors as well, and very, very early on the script went to Leonardo DiCaprio. That Nolan and DiCaprio had been having fairly regular meetings anyway over a number of years. DiCaprio wanted to work with Nolan, Nolan wanted to work with DiCaprio, and so the script was gradually coming together and the conversations were going. And in fact, Nolan's talked about how in certain instances some actors just get a small portion of the script. In the case of DiCaprio, he was the person who got the whole thing, and he was the person also who had a lot of input on it. That both Nolan and Emma Thomas have credited DiCaprio and his questioning and his pushing back with substantively improving the final screenplay of the film. That Nolan would tell Tom Sean that DiCaprio made a difference. He said it was a fraught, difficult process, that the rewriting went on for months and months because he's very demanding. This is Nolan talking of DiCaprio, but it was very productive, and I think he made it a more resonant film. But between them, they got to a point where this was ready to shoot, that this could press ahead and the rest of the casting could move forward. But with DiCaprio in place, the rest of the ensemble had to work with DiCaprio as the leader of the group who were taking out this heist. And so the ages of the other characters had to just come down slightly so DiCaprio wouldn't be seen as the youngest one in the group. One of the earliest pieces of casting was Marion Cotillard, who had just won an Oscar at this point for her role in La Vie en Rose, and she took on the co-starring role of Mal. In terms of the rest of the ensemble, I mean, a lot of it came together fairly quickly and organically in the end. The one person who spoke about it was Elliot Page, then Ellen, who told MTV of the process that I actually had a general meeting with Chris because I'm a huge fan of his films. They said I didn't know about Inception when I met him. I really liked him, such a down-to-earth guy, no ego at all, just a pleasant, enjoyable guy to talk to. And Page left the meeting just thinking that, and then it was a week or so later that the idea of Inception came through, that Nolan was thinking of Page for Inception. Then Page got to read the script in an office, wasn't sent a copy to take away, loved the script, was totally into the idea and playing the part, and signed on the dotted line. It's worth noting too that Warner Brothers and Legendary Pictures were definitely pressing ahead at this point. The luring of Leonardo DiCaprio to headline the film was it wasn't the thing that got it over the line, but that's a nice bit of protective mitigation, really, putting what was going to be a very risky blockbuster film out into the market. And DiCaprio in the lead role of Cobb, now a character with more emotional stakes because of the work that he and Nolan have been doing. Well, there was something in it really for everybody there. The building of the film, though, was going to be complex, that Nolan didn't want to do this on a small scale. And ordinarily, he would go back to Nathan Crowley, who'd helped, the production designer, who'd helped build the Batman films with him. But this time, Nathan Crowley wasn't free. He was engaged on the John Carter movie, which I'm coming to in a future episode of Film Stories, and that meant that Nolan needed to look around for another production designer to work with. Thus, for what would turn out to be his sole collaboration with Nolan, it was Guy Hendricks Dias who got the nod. Now, he had come to some degree of prominence working with Shakur Kapoor on the Elizabeth movie, Elizabeth the Golden Age, and he'd worked on X2, Superman Returns. He'd been on Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And so he got the nod, and one of the key challenges was designing the kind of decaying, fraying, limbo world element that we see in the film. That it sort of had to look realistic, but it also had to have a kind of dreamlike state as well. And this was one of the key production design challenges of the movie. How on earth do you come up with that? It took months to do, with VFX supervisor Paul Franklin, a key part really of the team that cracked this kind of frayed, slightly broken look that they came up with, that was ultimately signed off when Nolan took a look at what they come up with on a laptop after all this work and said, yep, I've seen nothing like that on film before. And that was the way forward they were going to go. It took, in the end, even after the design work had been completed, nearly a year really to realise just how it was going to appear on screen. It was one of the key creative moments of the film, was just making sure that it looked unusual, it looked slightly off. And there's a lot of visual tricks, there's a lot of practical visual tricks actually in Inception to get a very warped view of the world that's presented on screen. Now, a film that inevitably required an awful lot of planning, not least because of the complexity of the narrative and how easy it could be, if they didn't get this right, to lose the audience as the film's layers built more and more and more. Now, going back to that Tom Shun book, one of the ways that Nolan really just gave an overview of the story that he'd fashioned, there's a scan in that book, and it's just like a single plain sheet of A4 that maps the storyline of a particular moment of the heist in the film. And it starts with this straightforward line at the top of it, and gradually more and more things spider off it. And this is a sheet of paper that just covers one of the main plot points of the film. I looked at this sheet of paper and I just thought, I dread to think what the equivalent sheet would look for something like Tenet, where the complexity just goes completely off the chart. But the bottom line of it all was that this film that had been in Nolan's head just as a seed of an idea to this stage for around a decade, if not longer really, was now fleshed out in a lot of detail. I mean, even at the point filming was beginning in June of 2019, composer Hans Zimmer had already been briefed on the film. This wasn't a case that the composer comes in at the very end of the process and has a month or two to fashion the music. That Zimmer was shown the script, he was shown the sets, he was very early part of putting the film together. Not as early as he would be on the film Interstellar, but still there was an established working relationship building up here between Zimmer and Nolan that would make sure that the music was a very, very early consideration in comparison to the way several other filmmakers work. June the 19th, 2009, that was the day the first shot of Inception was captured. It was on location in Japan. They were using the bullet trains and shooting scenes there. And what Nolan was trying to get really was going back to the 007 films of his past, the idea of a globe-trotting film, the real scale of movies that he was grown up with. But also what he was very, very aware of was he wasn't making an art house independent film. He couldn't hide behind things really. This had to be a big, broad audience blockbuster. That didn't mean treating the audience as unintelligent, but he knew he was spending $160 million. It was reported as $200 million while they were shooting, and as such the people putting that level of money in would need some kind of return on it. The reason the budget had inflated was because it was shooting in locations around the world, that these weren't nimble units take from place to place, and the practical costs of moving an already expensive production from continent to continent was sending the price tag north. Zimmer, incidentally, when he was writing the score, one thing just to add to that as well, he would write his score without seeing the film. That he would have the conversations, he would see the materials that were setting up the film, but he wouldn't see the film before he wrote the score. So it wasn't quite writing it blind, but also he wasn't having to precisely tailor it, at least in the first instance, to individual moments right down to the second. Nolan's way of filmmaking, by reputation, is very, very practically driven. That was certainly the case here with Inception as well. This has just been recorded as Oppenheimer came out in cinemas 3 months ago at the point I'm recording this, and there's a lot of talk around Oppenheimer about how visual effects work wasn't used and it was all practical, whereas actually visual effects work was used. So the story was played down a little bit. Things like additional dialogue recording in post-production wasn't being used, and yeah, it is used in Nolan films. I know people who work in post-productions who have done work on Nolan's films. So as much of the stories tend to be captured as much in camera at the time, there are post-production tricks and requirements needed to realise his films. But still, the drive was undoubtedly to capture as much as possible on the set. That it went from, he went from Japan back to Cardington in the UK, the converted aircraft hangar there that had been used to film key parts of his 2 Batman films to that point. The movie also built a set in Calgary in Canada on the side of a mountain, an actual practical set, and then it was a case of waiting for a snowstorm to hit before capturing the footage. Didn't take long, but that was the level of detail Nolan was going to, and the level of intensity really, in terms of getting the stuff in view of the camera lens. There were touch points for the film. By now, it's shrouded under this veil of mystery. It's easy to forget, looking back in hindsight, just how little was known of Inception, even as it was filming. That films such as like The Dark Knight Rises, which Nolan would make next, I mean, quite a lot of that got out during the making of the film. With Inception, they managed to keep a lot of secrets, right down to just people knew who was in it, but people didn't know what it was going to be about at all. If you look at the mix of touch points, I mean, Hitchcock films were touch points, Spellbound and Vertigo, for instance. That Freddy Krueger TV spin-off, Freddy's Nightmares, the story The Circular Ruins was a key influence. Also, I didn't know that Nolan had screened Alan Parker's film Pink Floyd The Wall for the cast and crew ahead of filming. And as Nolan noted, it's just like from the very beginning, the challenge of making the film, the challenge of filming this movie was simple: how to make the dream world matter to the viewer as much as the real world, and avoid the groans that greet any explanation along the lines of, oh, it was just a dream. And he described right through the making of the film, that was the overwhelming difficulty. How do you address the idea of dream life and raise those stakes without invalidating the experience of the audience watching the film? Well, we go back to the practicalities, and these also came across in the edit, that the practicalities were so astonishing. Why would you edit around them a lot of the time? So there's a very famous sequence where the corridor starts spinning on screen. I'm going very spoiler light on the movie, but this was practically realised. It was a case of the crew in pre-production building a 100-foot long hallway that then had 8 huge rings on the outside, that this hallway was then suspended and then powered by electric motors. It took a pair of motors that would rotate through 360 degrees, and in the midst of those there's Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was shooting this particular practical sequence for 6 weeks alone. I mean, it just took to get that on film. It was a challenging shoot, just with the globe-trotting and the technical demands of it. It's worth noting that Elliot Page, in his memoir, which has just come out just a few months before I'm recording this, had particular struggles. That he talked about how, while on the set of the film, to quote his book, shingles popped out of my spine while filming. And he said, I did not understand the role I found myself in. Despite everyone being delightful to work with, I felt out of place. And for the first 2 weeks of the film, I joked I would be recast with Keira Knightley, and rightfully so. Shingles communicated the stress my body felt, what my words could not, he wrote in the book, which is Page Boy. That's the name of his memoir. While the shoot was ongoing, a word too for editor Lee Smith, who was editing as the film was going along. That he wasn't far from Nolan's side, but set up editing facilities at Cardington at one point, and at one point was following the shoot to Paris with a laptop and editing sequences on a laptop in France. Given the veil of secrecy again over the film, I mean, this took intense security measures, because the bloke's walking around with a laptop with only a limited number of scenes they allowed on. So Smith couldn't have the whole film on his laptop, but he was working just on this portable device while Nolan was also shooting. There was also, the whole film was on a 1 to 2 terabyte hard drive that was being taken around and locked away each night. Can you imagine if that had leaked? Not least again because the film was so under wraps, because it was going to be such a surprise. Astonishing the security measures in the end they had to take just to keep it safe and secure. In the end, perhaps unsurprisingly, it was a very long shoot given the geography involved and given the complexities involved, and it 6 months in all. It didn't wrap up filming until February 2010, but that was the key of editing as you go along, because the release date was, and this was going to be a big summer release, it had a release date of July 2010. Should note out it's shot by Wally Pfister, one of the last films that Pfister did with Nolan, and I would imagine he was part of a conversation that was taking place between Nolan and Warner Brothers about the possibility of releasing Inception, imagine this, in 3D. because we're in early 2010 now. Avatar has just done astonishing amounts of money at the box office, and its ticket premium has been boosted significantly by the fact people were willing to pay more money to see it if they could see it in 3D. And those of us who were regular cinema goers at this point will well remember the rush to bolt on 3D at all costs to a film to try and get a few more quid out of people. Warner Brothers was one of the worst perpetrators of this, notably with its 3D bolt-on done in weeks in post-production on Louis Leterrier's Clash of the Titans remake, which was a horrific job. The director has very loudly criticised that since, but from a commercial decision for Warner Brothers, albeit a short-term one, it worked. The 3D premium bolstered the box office, and so someone, can you imagine being the executive who walked up to Nolan and said this, suggested, well, why don't you have a look at doing this in 3D? So Nolan, perhaps unsurprisingly, was not keen. He's become a keen advocate of the IMAX format, shooting sequences in IMAX, but 3D just felt a bit gimmicky, really. Still, what I didn't know, and only discovered while researching this, was he did actually do some tests to see if it was worth giving it a try, and quickly concluded he wasn't. Such was his clout within the world of Warner Brothers that when he said he wasn't going to do it in 3D, well, Warner Brothers needing a Batman film off him next, it wasn't going to argue, and thus the 3D question was quietly retired. Now, Nolan knew right throughout that Inception was a gamble as well, and I spoke to him this year actually ahead of the release of Oppenheimer, and I did put to him that a lot of the time he comes across as this bulletproof filmmaker, and I was just like, well, when do you feel the most vulnerable when you're making a film? And he answered just without missing a beat that it is the point where he has to start showing it to people. It is the point of release. And so, I mean, it's a fairly obvious answer to the question, granted, but I don't think oftentimes we think of Nolan as a man who's perhaps insecure about his films and worries about his films, but he was having problems with Inception. That he hadn't done this with The Dark Knight, but what he did with the film was he did screen early versions of the movie for people he trusted. He needed to see, such was the potential complexity of the plot, if it all stacked, if people could follow the world that he was trying to build on screen, because he knew this could potentially be confusing and he wanted to make sure that audiences got it. And in fact, it was a few weeks into cutting the film, as he told Tom Shawn again in the book The Nolan Variations, he said somewhere a few weeks into the cut, where normally you'd be gaining a little bit of confidence that it's coming together, we had a screening and we just hit this wall of exposition. And he described it, there were two massive chunks. The first was the scene with Michael Caine, which was a massive hurdle to get over. We got stuck on that for a long time. And then there was the later reel where there was just a lot of exposition. And they walked out of that screen. He said, we were just white as sheets afterwards. He said he couldn't get to sleep for a couple of days. And it took ruthless cutting work to trim these scenes down, to stop the exposition dump, to stop it coming across as starkly as it was doing in earlier cuts of the film. Now, while Nolan was making the film, there was a challenge at Warner Brothers about how on earth do you sell it? And here's a character who I don't talk about much on this podcast, but I find a fascinating person in the world of modern cinema. And it was Warner Brothers' head of marketing and publicity at the time, someone called Sue Kroll. And she was the person who had the challenge of how on earth do you explain this film that's virtually unexplainable, that we're in an era where cinema is described usually in a tagline of 1 or 2 lines or something like that, that you can put out a trailer that just gets you to the nub of a film fairly quickly. Not a chance. They realised very early on not a chance of that with Inception. And so Sue Kroll knew, and the Warner Brothers marketing team knew, they had to sell this in a very different way, but they still needed blockbuster style results at the end of it. And so they did a couple of really clever things. I mean, they did the obvious thing, which was selling 1 or 2 of the key sequences in the movie, but also they pivoted the way they promoted the film and lent on the filmmaker. That, okay, they got a movie star, they got DiCaprio, but they made the name of Christopher Nolan, perhaps for the first time, a key part of the marketing drive of the film. Now, when Oppenheimer was being sold earlier this year, the name Nolan was everywhere all over it, as you would expect at this stage. But what Sue Kroll was doing was pretty radical, particularly for a film with the budget of this one. And so it was a gamble on lots of sides to see whether that would carry over, not least because so many secrets were being kept about the film, that Nolan and his team had kept so much of it under wraps. Just like, how much really do you want to give away? And the answer was not much at all. It would prove to be a genius marketing campaign that was put together. In fact, for another example of Sue Kroll's work, have a look at the campaign for the Ben Affleck film, The Town, also credited with being a really superb way to promote a big blockbuster movie. I should note that as much as there was an ingenious marketing campaign behind all of this, Warner Brothers also had to spend very big to get the message across. It was said that it spent around $100 million just on the promotion of the film, noting that it was not a franchise film. And at this stage in blockbuster cinema, it was franchise films, superheroes, things based on previous properties that were selling the most. And here, in the middle of a high summer slot, Warner Brothers was trying to sell something really quite radical, really. I don't think there's any other way to put it. The first trailer the first official trailer, there was a teaser that came out like a year before. There was a website that was being very, very clever about trying to tease what the film was about. The full trailer didn't turn up until May of 2010, and it was only then that the secrets of the film was starting to be uncoupled a little, but the response and the levels of intrigue were very, very much on the up. That the film was burning into its July release date off the back of increasing awareness and a sound in a trailer, which, as you heard right at the start of this, would be repeated a lot in the years following. The critical response was important to the film. It's often said that critics make no difference to blockbuster films, and I do think there's something to that. In the case of Inception, the near universal praise for the film, I do think had a big part to play in some of its success. The reviews for this were absolute raves in lots and lots and lots of places. There are a couple of people who didn't go for it, as I always seem to say when I'm getting to this bit of the podcast, but it was clear that this was a wildly ambitious film. And even those who felt it had missed the mark just a little bit were standing back at just the sheer brass of it, really. I mean, look at the other films that were coming out that summer, just to give you an idea of what it was. We had The A-Team was out. There was a Twilight sequel. It was Despicable Me. There was Night and Day. There was Predators. There were far more conventional looking blockbuster films coming out. Iron Man 2. There was a Harry Potter film coming later that year. The big films of the year were all to some degree franchise movies, and not all of those were doing wonderful business either. It was with a huge sigh of relief, though, that Inception opened to $62 million in the US, $62.7 million on the weekend of July the 16th to the 18th. It had competition. Disney had put out The Sorcerer's Apprentice that same weekend, and in ordinary times, you would expect that to have done slightly better than it actually did. But Inception, playing to it had a broad family rating. It was a 12A certificate film. There were little bits of complaints about the audibility of dialogue, which is a debate that's run through a lot of Nolan cinema. But still, there was a feeling that this was an intelligent film that lots of people could get to see. The number one film was Inception. The number two film that week was Despicable Me. It was down to, on its second week of release, in second place with 32 million. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, 17.6 million. And that was really the competition, that Inception was number one by a lot. And it was number one in its second week as well, in spite of competition from the Angelina Jolie headlined thriller Salt. Inception kept on burning throughout the summer. Its third week, it held off the challenge from Dinner for Schmucks, which came out. It would be The Other Guys in the end that knocked it off the top of the chart, and by the time it was off the top of the chart, Inception had over 200 million in the bank just from US cinemas alone. The US gross of the film would be 292 million, but then, to the delight again of the people who paid for it, the film delivered overseas as well. 546 million outside of America was a stunning stunning result. And Inception sat there with a box office at $839 million for a non-franchise blockbuster film. That's more than Batman Begins pulled in, not as much as The Dark Knight, but this was a tremendous achievement. And the acclaim kept on coming as well, that the film then found itself in the Oscar conversation. It was nominated for Best Picture at the 83rd Academy Awards. That was where The King's Speech won the top prize. But Inception still walked away with 4 Oscars for its cinematography, for its sound editing, for its sound mixing, and for its visual effects. Nolan was nominated for his screenplay, but not for his direction. The ones that it lost was Best Picture, Best Original Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Original Score. But Inception nonetheless had walked away with 4 Oscars, a whole lot of money. Christopher Nolan's reputation, if it needed enhanced, and it would be all the rocket fuel he needed to move on to his next project, The Dark Knight Rises. And that, again, is a film I'm going to come to in another episode of the podcast. And that brings me to the halfway point of this episode. So the parish notices. I've already plugged the magazine, so I'm just going to quickly mention we also have Film Junior magazine, and the latest issue of that is about to go on sale. I'm just signing that off once I've finished recording this podcast. If you like this podcast, there are a couple of ways you can support it, and thank you to everyone who does this. This is independent. This is a boring old man in a room just waffling into a microphone. Well, not old, middle-aged. Let's go middle-aged. And so if you want to support what I'm doing financially, you can do so at Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get the podcast early, you get it ad-free. You find out what I'm up to behind the scenes as well. Not always that interesting, but you find it out. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. If you could ideally as well leave a hugely positive review, things like that help with algorithms that I do not understand. It's only because of the support of people like yourselves that I've been able to keep this going so long. Film Stories is over 5 years old now, which is staggering when I sit there and think about it, and is the reason I've got no hair at all, it seems, these days. Too much information? I get you. Let's stop the parish notices for now. Let's go on to the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of the podcast. And this time I'm another British filmmaker, actually. We're going back to 2012. Let me play you a clip from the trailer, and I'll come to the story of this film the other side of this.
Show me your world, Chris.
Well, I thought we'd start with Christchurch Tram Museum.
Great.
Dear Mum, Yorkshire is lovely, not that you said at all. They can smile, and they do sell my pasta sauce. The caravan bed is quite short, but Chris is a sensitive lover. Hope you can be happy for me. Love, Tina.
Yeah, good girl.
You are going to pick that up?
I didn't do that.
If you don't pick up this excrement immediately, then I'm going to have to inform the National Trust.
Report that to the National Trust, mate.
And that is a clip from 2012 Sightseers, directed by Ben Wheatley, written by Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, who also take the 2 lead roles in the film. And God, this is a film. If you've not seen this one, what a treat. Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, let's start there. They were the originators of what became this film. And they met in the early 2000s at a regular comedy night that was taking place in Ealing in London. Now, they got chatting about their respective Midlands backgrounds. I am from the West Midlands. I'm very proud of my background. They talked too about family holidays. As Alice Lowe would remember to The Guardian, she would talk about how her dad would drive them around Europe. They couldn't afford to fly, so they'd go in a car, and she just said we'd have these weird experiences. We'd be camping in someone's orchard with some creepy farmer coming on to my mum. She talked about how she remembered this Dutch family, all blonde and beautiful on their bicycles, the dad barbecuing in the rain in a really capable, athletic way, and how her dad was just scowling at him. And she just reasoned, there's something just really hilarious about all the little prejudices and jealousies. And this was starting to inform 2 characters that Alice Lowe and Steve Oram came up with. They would be Chris and his girlfriend Tina, Chris being an aspiring writer, Tina, who is basically trying to, a degree, impress her mum, played in the film by the wonderful Eileen Davis. And they workshopped this. They came up with a kind of a stage sketch show, which is where they first debuted these characters at the Ealing event that they met up with. And as they told IndieWire, they just said, we just found it funny, them talking about mundane things and then disposing of body parts in the same breath. And as Steve Oram would say, the idea to have them going on holiday and knocking people off whilst visiting tram museums was something that made us laugh. And they both realised there might be something in this. Now, their careers were slowly developing. I mean, just look at Alice Lowe's. Her career took a jump forward when she was cast in the stage version of Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. She found her way onto television, and she and Steve Oram were developing what would become Sightseers, and they turned it into a TV pitch, which they filmed. Now, Sightseers, if you've not had the pleasure, is a very dark comedy. There is brutal murder set alongside a lot of laughs. But it was the darkness of the story they wanted to tell that was resulting in them, when they sent their pitch out to TV companies, being shown the door a lot. And as Lowe said, everybody was coming back to us and going, it's really funny, but we can't possibly commission it. And she argued they'd worked on these characters, they'd pushed it, and she said it felt at certain points there were pressures from people asking if they had to be set in Birmingham, if they had to be Brummies, can we not film it just outside London? And they were sticking to their guns. Me and Steve were like, no, it has to be people who their hopes and dreams are based around the fact that they didn't have the opportunities that they could have had. That Lowe's talked quite a lot about growing up in the Midlands and how that's very different from the people who grew up in London. As someone who grew up in the Midlands, sometimes there was just not a lot to do. There wasn't exciting things going on the doorstep. You couldn't take a tube 20 minutes and be into the heart of things. If you were stuck in the outskirts of the Midlands, a lot of the time you were stuck in the outskirts of the Midlands. Now, that pitch that they did was directed by Paul King. Now, Paul King, who was doing The Mighty Boosh around this time, has gone on to do the Paddington films, of course. Just at the point this is recording, we're a couple of months away from his Willy Wonka film, Wonka. But that pitch wasn't going really very far, and they were getting the rejection. So they stuck it on the internet. And that's when Lowe also sent it to Edgar Wright. And now Edgar Wright saw it and loved it. This was post Hot Fuzz, and he forwarded it to the production company Big Talk, and Wright would join as executive producer as well. And I should also point out that the other production company that would ultimately come aboard the film was Rook Films, which is Ben Wheatley, Claire Jones and Andy Stark. And so as Ben Wheatley, who would come aboard as director, he saw this, he got sent this by Big Talk, and he just said, oh, this could make a movie. Now, at the point he saw it for the first time, his own career was only just building up, really. But after the acclaimed release of his own directorial debut, Down Terrace, which is a terrific film if you've ever had the pleasure, Big Talk got the script to him. So Down Terrace came out in 2019, and then Wheatley was moving on to the film Kill List, which I should come to in a future podcast as well at some point. But he also, those two films he'd authored with his co-writer and partner Amy Jump. This was now going to be the first time he'd taken on someone else's script. And so Wheatley described that he'd had a meeting with Big Talk, and they said they had this script, and the script was Sightseers. And he said, I knew it had come from Alice and Steve, and I pretty much agreed to do it without reading it because I knew them and wanted to work with them. Now, he'd worked with them already on a pilot for a TV show called Wrong Door that never ultimately got made. He also knew them from the comedy scene, and he said, I knew they'd come from an improv background, and I really fancied doing something that was quite free and easy. He said, you can bend their work out of shape because they always know the backgrounds of the characters. And Wheatley also said Amy Jump, who is my writing partner and co-editor, gets an additional material credit as she wrote additional scenes and characters, helped with the orders of events. But also Film 4 was getting involved and put a bit of development money in. Now, this paid for research trips, and in particular the Lowe and Oram went on 2 research trips around the UK in character, followed by a camera that was shooting the whole thing. And on one of those trips, Steve Oram and Alice Lowe shared a caravan for the whole trip. When she said, this really cemented our interaction as a fictional couple, as I now know exactly how annoying he could be. Beautifully, the trip that they went on, at least one of the trips, was planned by Steve Oram's dad as well, and they went round an assortment of fairly low-key tourist attractions. And it was off the back of all of this work that over the course of 3 years, 3 drafts were put together. And Lowe would just reflect that a lot of the dynamic is based on observing your parents over a long period, seeing what people will put up with and what compromises people make to be together. And she said that was what we wanted people to get from the film. Why do people stay together? The research was quite intense as well. Lowe dug into the work of Robert Hare, a criminal psychologist researcher. She also looked at the cliche of female characters in cinema, deliberately went against that. Oram and Lowe also lent as an influence on With Nail and I, a film they're both very, very fond of. There was, as shooting approached in the autumn of 2011, just a slight fear that because the film takes them around British tourist attractions that don't necessarily tend to make the top of the TripAdvisor list, that some of them wouldn't necessarily be on the cooperative side. And I put this to Ben Wheatley, who now was making, he'd come off the back of Kill List, this was going to be his next film. And he just said none of them turned us down. And they were all super helpful. But he did reconcile, it's a tricky one, isn't it? He said, I think we were pretty open with them about what we were going to do and what the film was about. But you can't really put across tone in those conversations. And he said, I don't think anyone knew what the film was going to be like until it was done, because you just don't. He said, you might know what you're going for, but you might not get that, or you might get something else. That notwithstanding, they had enough here to get going. It was going to be a small cast fleshed out with the wonderful Monica Dolan, Jonathan Harris came in, Richard Lumsden, Richard Glover. And it was going to be, 4 or 5 week shoot. The start of production was announced for the beginning of October 2011. And this was going to be location driven. They would go on their travels across Derbyshire, Yorkshire, the Lake District, all around England, visiting genuine museums that you see in the film. Now, just ahead of the start of filming, they did do some rehearsal work. Wheatley talked about these characters needing to work as film characters, that they'd worked on stage, they'd worked in TV, but they had to feel very, very real. They had to feel like the kind of people you could spend 90 minutes in. And he talked about the rehearsal process being mainly to take those characters and put them to bed, really. There was space for a lot of improvisation and interviews during that rehearsal period. There was improvisation while they were filming it as well. Wheatley also put in his homework and preparation to make sure that as the cameras roll, they wouldn't shy away from the violence, that the violence in the film is very, very intense. It's deliberately baiting the Daily Mail tabloid, which it did, as it turned out, and it comes in these short bursts. But the thinking was, if you're going to have real people and real characters and they commit real crimes, you can't make the violence cartoony. And he did concede, I really fought to get the gore in. Because he says, you start to think about what you're laughing at. He says, you sit through Fast and Furious and 1,000 people get shot in that. And it's as violent as a Bourne film, and it's a 12. In the case of Sightseers, this was clearly not going to be a 12, and because of the relatively modest budget of the film, it was never declared, but you couldn't imagine it's more than a couple of million. He had the control to be able to put his stamp on the violent nature of the film. Now, that doesn't mean it's wall-to-wall violence. It's just very, very, very carefully chosen. The film went into post-production and a release date was being put together for the end of 2012, but with Studio Canal picking up distribution rights in the UK, the plan was to debut the movie at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2012. Now, that's okay. It didn't take an awful long time to edit the movie, and Wheatley would say that his television work was really a help here. That I asked him about the edit, and also I asked him about wrestling comedy on film. That comedy was something he'd had in his films, but he never lent into it as much. And the whole idea that it could just be like just a couple of frames could make the difference. And he said, no, it's not a couple of frames, it is a frame. And he said, I learned that from working with Henry Normal, a British television comedy legend. He said, the first thing I did with him was the TV show Ideal. He said he'd come into the edit suite, and what we do in Ideal is edit for a week, and then Henry comes in on the last day, looks at everything and goes through it all, and he'd be saying, cut that frame out, add a frame on that, and we'd be looking at each other going, some variant of Clucking Hell, I think that says, what's all this? And we watch it and it'd be better. And he says it hinges on it. The timings are absolutely crucial. It also helped too that Wheatley just says that he never really gets a full feel anyway of what a film is until it's done. And he says, you have this script, you know where you're going, but films are about performance and lucky accidents. And in the edit, you find other text and subtext when you're putting it together. He says it's disingenuous to say you don't know at all, but a script is not a blueprint that you can absolutely predict what will come out of it. And that was the case too with Sightseers as well, that as much as these characters had been in existence since the early to mid 2000s, and as much as Alice Lowe and Steve Oram knew them a lot by the time the cameras were pointed at them, you still didn't quite know where it was going to end up. Off then, with the film completed, the film went to the Cannes Film Festival, and I think it's one of those cases where you just genuinely don't know what the response was going to be, that the tonal shifts of the film are quite dramatic, and it's not a compromised film. This is obviously a very good thing, but it can make the critical response a little bit difficult. But on the whole, the response to Sightseers was really pretty good. Now, a couple of the UK's more prominent critics didn't really go for it as much, but there was enough of a critical thrust in its favour that there was confidence in the release of the film, that they felt that this could cut through. Some people just didn't find it funny. If you don't get the humour, you're in trouble. And in fact, when the film came to its wide release in the UK towards the end of 2012, infamously the Daily Mail critic gave it 1 star, and Ben Wheatley promptly went onto Twitter, back when Twitter worked and was nice, and just almost declared it a badge of honour. 1 star from the Daily Mail. He'd be disappointed not to get that. There is a line in the film that absolutely trolls the Daily Mail as well, so they knew what they were doing. But there was a kind of feeling, it's like, this is offending the right people. If you're going to get upset by it, these are the people who are going to get upset. And there you go, it's the establishmenty newspapers, the holier than thou, who are really finding this gets under their skin. A couple of credits I should note. Neera Park, a legendary producer in the UK, was one of the producers on it, and also a shout out to Laurie Rose, the wonderful cinematographer who shot the movie. But would it do much business at the box office? Well, it went into UK cinemas on the 30th of November 2012, and by the time it had got away from its Cannes Film Festival response and was a bit more on its it was a bit more focused towards the more general criticism, well, the response was slightly more upbeat, with the exception of that aforementioned newspaper. That said, there are easier times to launch a film than the end of November. If you just look at the films it was up against, you can see how intense the competition was. That the James Bond film Skyfall was on its 6th week of release and would gross nearly £100 million, not even dollars, pounds in the UK by this point. It would cross that level in due course. The second Twilight film was going nuts. That was 3 weeks on release. There were other openers that weekend. DreamWorks' Rise of the Guardians, you would not say is a direct competition to Sightseers, but it was taking up screen space. Great Expectations was out. There was Talash was also playing. Alex Cross opened, and there'd been reasonable hopes for that as well. And then from the UK, Nativity 2, Danger in the Manger, I feel my best not comment on, I paid to see that, was also sat in the top 5. Silver Lining Playbook was around as well. And if you even look at the films, the rest of the top 10, Argo, End of Watch, I mean, this was competition and a half. And Sightseers ended up in the end in 12th place, taking £213,000 on its opening weekend. Now, that's not particularly shabby, really, and over time the film would make its money back on DVD of its Channel 4 screenings as well. I mean, it would do pretty well there. The second week on release for the movie, it was down, it lost half its business, £100,000, down to 13th place, as out came 7 Psychopaths as the big opener that week. But again, Skyfall was still going absolutely nuts. By its 3rd week of release in the UK, which was the 14th to the 16th of December, well, Sightseers was dropping. It was down to 15th. It had lost the vast bulk of its business, £27,000 on its 3rd week, as the first of the Hobbit films came along, as a Tinkerbell 3D movie came along as well. But still, by the end of its run, I mean, it was over £500,000. It hadn't done great guns, but it had certainly gained attention, and it had done a decent. I'd imagine it had done pretty much aligned with expectations for its cinema release. What's nice though about Sightseers is it continues to be talked about and it continues to be seen. I mean, the fact we're here talking about it over a decade after it first came out, and as a calling card for the people concerned, I mean, again, there's lots to praise there. That Steve Oram will go off and direct his own film. Alice Lowe's gone off and she's in post-production now on her second movie as well. And then, of course, there's Ben Wheatley, who at the point this is recorded, just a couple of months ago, was behind the camera for Meg 2: The Trench, and he's built a significant body of directorial work. Sightseers, though, might just be my favourite Ben Wheatley film, and I love a lot of Ben Wheatley films. I think what Alice Lowe and Steve Oram put on screen together is quite something. And I've paired it with Inception for a reason, because I think the way these podcasts work sometimes is people are drawn in by the more prominent film and occasionally want to discover something of a gem as they go. That may be the case, that may be not. I may be completely misreading it. But if you are on the lookout for something special that you might not have seen, and you've got a bit of a stomach for it, I can't recommend Sightseers enough. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you always for listening. As always, for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories. I think it's on Blue Sky as well. We need to do something with it there. Facebook.com/Film Stories Online is where you'll find us there. YouTube.com/Film Stories. That YouTube channel is lumbering into life. We're doing quite a lot with that at the moment. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find our magazines for sale. We've also now put up for order our latest Blu-ray releases, for which we've put special extras on as well. We are doing the UK Blu-ray debut of a pair of Kevin Costner films, the Bull Durham and No Way Out. Neither has been issued on Blu-ray in the UK. As of 23rd of October 2023, you're able to get them both. You can find them at store.filmstories.co.uk, as well as all of our magazines as well. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, our website is full of movie mayhem, news, reviews, features. We update that a lot. We're putting a lot of work into that as well. But I've bored you enough, haven't I? Thank you so much for tolerating me this far. I'm now off to watch another bunch of films. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your support. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.